Hello, I'm Tashawn and this is Legacy Liner. Welcome aboard. So for today's video, we're going to be talking about the Goodwin family. And this story actually spans through like a 90-year time frame. It involves DNA testing, forensic science. It's a whole thing. So without any further delay, let's get into it. Frederick Goodwin was born in Surrey, England on February 1st, 1870. He was the second son of Charles Goodwin and Mary Ann Tyler. His father was a printer and a school caretaker. He grew up in the Newington area and he followed in his father's footsteps as a printer and compositor. Also growing up in this area would have been Augusta Tyler. Augusta Tyler was born in Middlesex, England on July 14, 1868. She was the daughter of Charles Tyler and Clara Ann Cook. She had 4 siblings and she grew up in Kensington and the Fulham area. By 1891, she was listed as a domestic servant at the Pockeridge House. At some point in this time frame, her and Frederick would have met and they would have gotten married on Christmas Day, 1894. And when I first read this, I thought this was very cute. I was like, oh, they got married on Christmas Day, how romantic. But I'm reading this other book about that era and people who were in poverty and things. And in this book, it also mentions that people would do like their official stuff on Christmas Day because that was the one day of the year that they would have off. So when I read that, I was like, oh, I hope that's not why they did it. I hope it was the cute, let's have a Christmas wedding type of thing. 2 years later, they ended up having their first child, Lillian. She was born on March 12, 1896. Not long after her, Charles was born on May 22, 1897. He would have been followed by William on August 12, 1898. And then Jesse on March 16, 1900, and Harold July 29, 1901. And then finally on September 9, 1910, we get to little baby Sydney. For several years, the family lived in the Middlesex area and then they moved to Wiltshire before 1910. By 1912, it appears that they were living in London. And Frederick, he was no longer working as a printer. He actually ended up switching careers. He was now a machine hand at a foundry, Henry White and Son. And one of the things that I admire about Frederick is that even though he had this large family, he had 6 children and a wife that he had to tend to and look after, he still, on top of this, took on the financial burden of supporting his widowed mother, as well as one of his brothers who was living with her, who was mentally and physically disabled. So this was back in the days before you really had any type of government assistance programs the way that you do today. So family really had to rely on each other to help each other through these difficult times. And Frederick, he would send money to help support his widowed mother and disabled brother. And there was also another brother living there with her. I imagine that he was helping her with the physical stuff around the house, but Frederick was doing a lot to help out financially. Now, Frederick had a few siblings who had already immigrated to America into the Niagara area in New York. So I guess he was already kind of entertaining the idea of maybe immigrating there with them, because he had a sister there that was married with kids, a brother there that was married with kids, and another sister who was widowed. So they had like their own little, I wouldn't say community, but they had their own little small village of family there. And him with his 6 kids, you know, immigrating to an area where they already knew people or would have kin, that definitely must have been a big perk to him. And everything ended up lining up because he had a brother named Thomas who worked in Niagara, and they were building a new power plant. The name of this power plant was the Sholkoff Sholkoff power plant. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. His brother Thomas worked there as a clerk in 3A. And so Frederick was going to go over there and immigrate because now that they're opening this new facility, they were doing a lot of hiring, and this would have been a great opportunity. I also want to take this time to give a special shout out to Anne Marie of the Niagara History Center. She was so gracious and kind, and she actually emailed me a picture of the Sholkoff power plant taken in 1914. And this picture was donated to them courtesy of Daniel. So thank you so much for giving us this image so that we can see where Frederick was heading to. I think having these little images and being able to put names to things, it just adds a little bit more of a human touch to their story. So the siblings got together and they decided they were going to help Frederick and his family immigrate to America. So there was a sister and a brother-in-law that gave them some money to help with the trip over, $150, which is about $3,000 in today's money, like over $3,000 in today's money. So it was a good chunk of change that they gave them. And then also what the family did is they already had a house set up for them, furnished and everything. So the Goodwin family had a job, a house, furniture, and family all waiting for them when they arrived in America. They had originally booked passage on another vessel. I heard it was the New York, but whatever vessel it was that they booked passage on, it got canceled because of the coal strike. And so then they got shifted over to the Titanic. So on April 10th, 1912 in Southampton, the family boarded and they started their trip to their new lives in America. Now, what exactly did they do on the Titanic is not known. Frank Goldsmith, who was, I think, 9 at the time, he talked about how him and some of the boys on the Titanic in third class, how they would play and just have a good time on the ship up until it hit the iceberg. He said that they would sneak down into the boiler rooms and they would wave at the firemen and hear them singing sea shanties as they're trying to keep on rhythm shoveling the coal. He also said that they would climb on the cargo cranes that the Titanic had because the poop deck is a working deck, so there's a lot of deck gear and stuff that has to do with the operation of the ship. And so apparently the young boys, just being boys, were climbing and crawling and doing all this stuff on these cranes. And I did read in a source somewhere that one of the Goodwin boys was one of the group of boys that Frank Goldsmith was hanging out with during his time on the ship. But for whatever reason, I cannot figure out where I read that. I read so many Titanic books, and I'm usually pretty good at being able to keep up with which one I read what in. But for this particular incident, I don't know. But I did at least want to mention it so that you could get an idea that that was at least something that one of the Goodwin family was doing on board the ship. Now, the same way that not much is known about what they did during the voyage, not much is known about what they did during the sinking either. The only thing that we do know is that Colonel Archibald Gracie, Frank Prentice, even a couple of people in the lifeboats remarked about how in the later stages of the sinking, there was this large crowd of people that ran up on deck. And Colonel Archibald Gracie and Frank Prentice, they remarked that it seemed to be third-class passengers. Well, the Goodwins would have been amongst that crowd of third-class passengers. And unfortunately, they would perish in the sinking. And here's a part of the story that I find very intriguing. There was a newspaper report where they talked about Augusta's sister. So 1 week after the sinking of the Titanic, on the following Sunday, there was a memorial service that was being held. I mean, there was many memorial services all over the world. But Augusta's sister was attending one of these memorial services that were being held. And she was just going out of respect. She didn't even know that her sister and her family were on the Titanic. Because remember, they originally booked passage on another ship. And word of mouth, stuff just didn't travel as fast back then as it does today with cell phones and everything else. So she went to this memorial service just out of respect, not knowing that her sister was one of the victims. And while she was there, she bumped into Frederick's mother. And Frederick's mother just assumed that she knew. So she handed her the telegram, which confirmed that the Goodwin family was not amongst the survivors. And I just can't imagine what must have been going through her mind as they were going through that memorial service. She was just going there to pay respects. And now she realizes that her sister, her brother-in-law, and 6 of her nieces and nephews have drowned in the middle of the North Atlantic. And so she just would have had to sit through the rest of that memorial service processing, oh my God, this hit closer to home than I thought it did. Thankfully, they did offer some level of financial reimbursement to his mother, Frederick's mother. The English fund ended up giving her 5 shillings a week. And his sister and brother-in-law, they were reimbursed for the $150 that they gave the family to immigrate over to America by the American Red Cross. And even though these 2 funds or charities or whatever did offer some level of reimbursement, it still didn't end up compensating for the full loss, because the loss was expected to be around $250, 1912 money, which is like over $6,000 in today's money. So they only got reimbursed for about half of what the losses was estimated to be. And that's not even getting into the actual human loss. That's just the financial aspect of it. So around the same time that this memorial service would have been happening, the Mackie Bennett would have been at the wreck site starting to recover bodies. And the crew, they understood the grim task that they were sent to go do. They were actually compensated extra money because of how grim the task was going to be. But that still don't change the fact that they're human beings. So when they got to the 4th body that they pulled out of the water, it was a young baby boy. And he didn't have a life jacket on. He had fair hair. And they were just struck by what they saw, this image of a young baby floating in the big, cold North Atlantic all alone. It just pulled at their heartstrings. And to me, it's also one of those things where it opens up that uncomfortable subject about children who died on the Titanic, because he was floating alone. So it makes you think, how many children got separated from their parents in their final moments? And how many of those parents spent their final moments desperately trying to gather their children and then realizing that it didn't matter because they couldn't even save themselves anyway. And so I think that the crew of the Mackie Bennett, when they saw this baby, maybe it just ignited some of those thoughts in them. And so what they ended up doing was they decided that if no one claimed the body of this baby, then they themselves would bury him. Once the Mackie Bennett arrived back in Halifax, the bodies were guarded and looked after, and whatever clothing that they were wearing when they were recovered, it was stripped off and they were given like some white generic clothes to wear. But the clothes that they actually had on, they decided to burn. And the reason they wanted to do that was to prevent any souvenir hunters from trying to get the clothes of the victims. And I also need to put this little snippet in here. They burned their clothing, but they kept things like pocket watches, jewelry, brooches, anything like that. And they sent those back to the loved ones so they can at least have the personal effects that were found on them. I covered that in the other video I did on what happened to the bodies of the victims. I'll put a link to that video in the comments. Well, one of the guards that was on duty was Sergeant Clarence Northover. And Sergeant Clarence Northover, he saw these tiny little pairs of shoes that would have been on this baby. And he watched as they were burning all of these other clothes, but those little shoes was just too much for him. Seeing those get burned, he couldn't bear. So he ended up taking them, sneaking them off, and he put them in a drawer and kept them. And he ended up passing those shoes down to his son, who then ended up passing them down to his son, Earl. So now the shoes are in the possession of Clarence Northover's grandson, Earl. Well, Earl decided that these shoes belong to the public. You know, they should be seen. It's a historical thing that's related to the sinking of the Titanic. So he donated them to the National Museum of the Atlantic. Earl believes that his grandfather kept the shoes because he wanted to give them to, a homeless child or a child in need or something. But Earl's wife, who I think hit the nail more on the head, she suspects that the reason that Sergeant Clarence Northover kept the shoes is because he had a young son named Charles who died in infancy. So she believes that maybe when he saw these shoes, like some sort of paternal instinct or something just kicked in and he just couldn't bear burning these shoes. True to their word, the crew of the Mackie Bennett, when they saw that no one claimed the unknown child, they paid for his funeral arrangements. They paid for his grave. He was put in a nice little casket. They had a nice little bronze plate that said, "Our Babe," and they put it on his chest. And on May 4th, 1912, they buried this little baby in the Fairview Lawn Cemetery. So now let's jump over 90 years later to 2002. So the movie Titanic had came out about 5 years ago. So at this point, the world is still Titanic crazy. They are in a frenzy. They want Titanic content as much as it can be delivered. So there was this documentary called Ghost of the Titanic that came out around this time. And the premise of this documentary, they were now going to start DNA testing some of the unknown victims in the Titanic cemetery. And there was 3 bodies that they were going to do DNA testing on. And the unknown child was one of those bodies. Well, unfortunately, they realized that with a lot of these graves, they were badly flooded, which compromised the DNA in some of these bodies. But when it came down to the unknown child, there were 3 teeth that they were able to find and a little bit of a wrist bone. They also found the remains of the bronze plate that said "Our Babe" that the Mackie Bennett crew had placed on them. Now, initially, the theory that they had was that this was one of the Paulson children. To some of my older subscribers, you might remember the video I did on the Paulson family a while back. Well, they thought it was one of those children because not long after the unknown child's body was found, Alma Paulson's body was found. And according to survivors' testimony, she was last seen, holding her children and when she got washed away by this wave. And so it would make sense that their bodies kind of stayed together. And I think everybody just wanted it to be the Paulson baby because it gave some little bit of closure, like, oh, it's okay, his mom is buried not too far away from him. And so they tested the DNA from the teeth with living relatives in the Paulson family, and it came back negative. So that was one child that they eliminated as a potential candidate. So at this point, there were 5 babies that it could have been. So eventually, they were able to narrow it down to 2 candidates. Sidney Goodwin, who was 19 months at the time, and Eno Panula, who was 13 months at the time. So they tracked down, and this was a whole process. They had to bring in a genealogist, and she had to track down the whole family tree and find living relatives that they had. And she took DNA from both families. And so now they were finally finna figure out who it was. Well, there was one problem. When they ran the DNA, it was a match for both babies. And what this meant is that both Eno Panula and Sidney Goodwin shared a common female ancestor within the last 2,000 years. So in other words, they were distant cousins. Now, what level? Who knows? It could have been that it was 3 generations back. It could have been literally all the way back to the times of Jesus almost. So we don't know exactly how close they were. Most likely their parents didn't even know that they were cousins. But still, I found that interesting. It just shows you how small the world really is. Well, this ended up causing a hiccup in the plan because the mitochondrial DNA that they were testing, they both matched, so that was a problem. Well, the way that they got around it is that the 3 teeth, they had them examined by pediatric dentists. What they were able to determine is that the roots in the teeth had not fully developed yet. And also, the teeth showed no sign of wear, which meant that this child most likely had not started eating solid foods yet. And so, based off of this information, the pediatric dentist, they ended up determining that the baby had to be somewhere between 9 to 15 months old. So, since they got both of the babies matching with the DNA, and then they got this new age range of what the child should be, they ended up assuming that Eno Panula was the unknown child, because with him being 13 months old, he fits perfectly in that age range that the pediatric dentist had said. And I loosely remember, I was still a child at the time, but I loosely remember that there were articles released about it, and I remember people going back and forth and disputing it. And one of the reasons that people were disputing it was because of those shoes. When people were actually looking at the pair of shoes, they thought that they were pretty big for a 13-month-old baby. And don't get me wrong, this was 1912, the Goodwins were a third-class family, so hand-me-downs was certainly a thing back in those days, especially for large families like the Goodwins. But the thing that was stumping people was that several days had passed between the sinking of the Titanic and the recovery of the body. So if the shoes, these slip-on shoes, were too big for this baby that had been floating out in the ocean for a few days, then wouldn't those shoes had slipped off? And so by this time, DNA is a very complex thing. I'll put a link to the video. I think it's Colleen Fitzpatrick. She has this very interesting presentation where she goes into like the nitty-gritty of the DNA testing part. But for this channel, we keep it simple. So basically, they did more intense DNA testing, and that's how they were able to determine that it was Sidney Goodwin who was the unknown child. After over 90 years of not having his identity, thanks to the determination of scientists, genealogists, historians, and most importantly, thanks to the kindness and compassion of the Mackey Bennett crew members that gave him a proper burial, and Sergeant Clarence Northover, who decided to preserve those shoes, they were finally able to give him his identity back. In 2008, the relatives of the Goodwin family all got together and went to Halifax, and they went to the Fairview Lawn Cemetery, and they had a memorial service in Sidney Goodwin's honor. They invited Colleen Fitzpatrick, the genealogist that tracked all of these relatives down to help figure out, who to test for the DNA. They invited her as an honorary family member. And they didn't just want to honor Sidney Goodwin, they also wanted to honor the other Goodwin children. So what they did was they called out the name of each one of these children and then rung a bell in their honor. Carol Goodwin, who was one of the relatives that attended, she said that it was a happy occasion because they were finally able to give some closure to this story. And one of the things I found interesting is that she also said that as they were having this memorial service, there was an ever so slight drizzle of rain coming down. And as they were reading these names and tolling the bell, this light drizzle was raining. But once they tolled the bell the last time, after saying the last name of the Goodwin children, the drizzle stopped. The family decided that they wanted to leave the original monument and have that serve as a memorial to not just the Goodwin family, but to the over 50 children who went down with the Titanic and their bodies were never recovered. I do believe at some point they added like another little nameplate in front of it, but I absolutely love the fact that they kept the monument as it was, especially since it was the crew of the Mackey Bennett that chipped in so that they could do that act of kindness for this baby. The Goodwin family, like so many other families that boarded the Titanic, were looking at a chance of starting a new and better life. But little did they know that their sweet little fair-haired baby boy would come to symbolize the face of so many children whose lives was tragically cut short on that cold April night. And alright, that's my video on the Goodwin family. I have to say I really enjoyed this because this was one of those stories where I've heard it and I knew certain little details, but as I started researching it, it just kept getting more and more interesting. So I really enjoyed reading up on their story. Don't forget to like and subscribe and come back so that way we can dig more into the human side of the story of the Titanic. Y'all have a good one.